Welcome to part two of the lecture. This is where we're going to actually start getting into the Korean War itself. The basis for the Korean War starts when we have the thing that we had been worrying about in the United States for so long, the expansion of communism. We do know that sort of some background to it. Japan had invaded and controlled Korea during World War II. And when the end of World War II starts to come about, we see that it was liberated from the north by the Soviet Union sweeping in and by the Americans in the south. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in just another slide here, but you can see how it's divided in half right at the 38th parallel. And there you have it. Soviets accepted Japan's surrender north of the 38th parallel, and the Americans accepted it south of the 38th parallel. I'm going to go ahead and switch slides here, so if you're not done writing, you should pause. In the north, because that's where the communists had accepted the surrender, that's where a pro-Soviet government was formed, a communist government. And in the south, you have a pro-American government, or a liberal democracy, like we have here. By 1948 and 49, you see the Soviets withdrawing from Korea and the Americans withdrawing from South Korea. And so you're just left with those two countries, brand new, that had just been set up, North and South Korea. And in 1950, that's when, out of nowhere, North Koreans stormed over the border. They poured into the south, caught everybody completely by surprise. Nobody was expecting an invasion so soon, and because of that, they were initially very, very successful. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next slide. The United States sent troops and warships, all sorts of airplanes, tanks, all that stuff. Sent that all to Korea to help defend the South Korean government that they had helped set up to begin with. You also have United Nations forces going in. This is sort of what the United Nations had been set up to do, is to mediate international disputes. And this was sort of their MO. They would send soldiers in, largely comprised of American forces, to defend member nations against aggressors. One quick thing to note, this has technically, even though we call it the Korean War, it technically was a police action because Congress did not ever declare war against North Korea. But because of the number of people involved and the fact that it was a fighting conflict, we do call it the Korean War. Now, you may be saying, Mr. Dimick, we talked about this in class. Why did the Soviets not veto UN forces? Isn't that one of the reasons that the Western Allies had to create NATO? Well, yes, that is the case, but the Soviets couldn't veto in this case because they had, at this point, walked out of the United Nations temporarily. And so because they were not around, they could not provide the veto in this case, and that is why the United Nations was able to get involved militarily in the Korean conflict. General MacArthur was the American general who had a lot to do with controlling the American and United Nations forces in South Korea. But getting back into the details of the conflict, after the initial invasion, when North Korea pushed through the border and, like I said, was initially very successful, they moved very far south, and you can see on the map on the right there's a city in South Korea at the very tip called Busan, and that's where everybody was pushed, and the entire South Korean army and what was left of the government was pushed down there, and the war was almost over, except for a very daring raid called, it was the invasion of Incheon, where you can see again on the second map there that they literally landed way behind the North Korean army and cut them off and forced them to start withdrawing. And we're not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty of the battles and who did what, when, and where in Korea, but as you can see, they had initially been pushed very far south, and then the American and UN forces pushed the Korean forces way back up, all the way almost to the Chinese border. Now, China was also involved in this conflict. They had warned the United Nations not to invade North Korea, but when they did, the Chinese got involved, and so even though the UN pushed all the way up to the Chinese border, they then pushed everybody, when the Chinese came in because of their massive numbers of troops, they pushed everybody back down, basically to where they started, right about at the 38th parallel. Now, we're just about done. We'll finish this up briefly in part 3.